hello again. I was looking through past podcasts, and I'm slightly surprised I haven't covered this before. I've certainly written about it, and that you will know from the title is a question that comes up reasonably regularly, and that is whether you can take great photographs with a smartphone. So, broadly speaking, he says, not committing himself, the answer is yes, but it does depend on the style of photography you are aiming for, your style of photography, and the smartphone you've got. However, I think the smartphone is probably a less critical variable these days, because if you're working or using a reasonably new smartphone, say less than 5-6 years old, and even back then they were pretty good, you should have quite a good camera built in, unless you've got some peculiar phone from somewhere. So I guess to answer the key question, can you take great photographs? Well, you have to remember that the smartphone and basically any camera is just a tool. So once you regard it as a tool, you start looking at who's wielding the tool, who's using the tool, how good is that person. So it does come back to that old adage that I'm sure I've spoken about before, that the most important part of any camera system is the 12 inches behind the viewfinder. In other words, the person who's taking the photographs. So what are the aspects to think of there? Well, you get into the broad photography categories. So composition, having the eye for a photograph, recognizing when something is going to happen, recognizing where you can get an unusual photograph. And that's something that I do want to talk about, because I think smartphone cameras are very good for that. In fact, I'm hoping to set up an interview podcast with Colin Winter-Seaton, whose photographs I will mention. He's on Instagram, and I worked with him at We Were Observers in Sydney, and he is very, very good at creating amazing photographs just from his smartphone. He's pretty much specialised in the smartphone area, even though he's got other cameras and he does use other cameras, but that's what he tends to use. So hopefully that will be coming along. But the smartphone is a camera, it's a tool, so it has certain limitations depending on what camera you have in your smartphone. It will have certain advantages. So the key thing is to really recognize what your smartphone camera is capable of doing, and then you running with that and making the most of what you have available. So that really is the bottom line on this. And you may find that you need a bit of experimentation just to play around, and I'll hopefully give you some ideas on what you can do in this podcast. So let me talk about some types of photography where the smartphone is very useful. There's a couple immediately spring to mind. One of them is street photography, where you're just trying to catch people just doing what they naturally do in the street, if you're into that kind of photography. Obviously, a smartphone is very discreet, and there are definitely photographers who specialise in that area who've switched across to smartphones, because walking around with a camera, something like a DSLR or an SLR or a mirrorless camera, you're more conspicuous than if you're just using your phone, because walk on any street and you will find people looking at their phones, and sometimes they're holding them up or they're walking with them, but it's not unusual to see somebody holding a smartphone. So people tend not to take any notice of you, and in that way you get much better photographs. So that's one area where smartphones have an advantage over more traditional cameras. Now, another one that I really like is getting close to a subject. Now, it's not necessarily macro. I'm thinking more in terms of just getting the camera in really close against something. Let's say you want to shoot just chairs on the street, something like that. You can just put the phone right up against the chair. Or one that springs to mind so this is going to Sydney, Circular Quay, but they have these stores for tourists on the quay, and a lot of them have these sort of glass doors that fold up. So they're made of panels. That when you slide the door back, the panels kind of all line up. So when the doors open, basically, so that people can walk in, you've got this, I don't know what you would call it, an array of panels, if you like, or a parallel line of these panels as they're in the sort of closed position for the door. So that gives you an unusual view, and you can put your camera up very close to that. If you want to shoot a plant, you can stick the phone in very close, perhaps in a different way that you could with a camera that's got a lens on it. Now, don't forget, with most smartphones, although you'll have the obvious camera button on the touch screen, usually you can also take a photograph by using one of the volume buttons or either of the volume buttons, the up, down on the side. So if you want to get the camera in a position where it's not easy for you to just press the regular shutter button, check on your phone, but usually you can use the volume buttons to also act as a shutter button for you. And I was just looking, I've got a Samsung phone, and that also has the option of a floating a shutter button on the screen. So I've not played with it, I've only just found it, to be perfectly honest, but that may be useful to you, so you don't have to always be trying to get your hand on the on that shutter button on the screen, because that might compromise where you've actually put the phone. I mean, you've got the same advantage of any digital camera, of course. You can try different shots. If you can't see the screen when you're taking the shot, you can just dive in and have a go and take a few. But I think that's a really significant advantage, and it opens the door to you to start producing some very creative photographs. So, for example, with the chairs, or let's say you found a bench in a street somewhere, try taking a photograph by putting the camera underneath the bench. So shoot along the bench, the length of the seat, but do it from underneath rather than from on top. You can. These are the kind of things that I'm talking about when I say that the most important part of the camera system is the 12 inches behind the viewfinder, because this is where you can begin to experiment, because the tool you're using allows you different access perhaps to what you would normally use. So this is where you can experiment. So have a look at someone like Colin. So look up Colin, do a search for Colin Winter Seaton. So it's Colin, Colin, Winter, Winter, and Seaton is Seton. So I'm sure he doesn't mind me asking you to look for him. He's also got a site called Very Well Adjusted, so you can also check that one. And he has lots. I think there's well over 1,000 photographs now, possibly more than that. But he's a very creative photographer. And if you're just looking for ideas and things you can do with a smartphone, you could certainly do a lot worse than checking out his Instagram gallery. So I'll put a link in the description as well, so you might have already seen that link, but do please have a look there. So that's one thing. Now, another thing to think about is that most smartphone cameras that I'm aware of, and that's not all of them by any means, but they have a thing called HDR. Now, I think the default is normally that it's on, which is a good thing. So HDR stands for high dynamic range. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that if you can get photographs where one area is overexposed to the point where it's burnt out. So it might be the sky, it might be a light or something like that. Particularly if you're looking at sky and you've got a darker subject in the foreground. The cameras in smartphones are like a lot of automatic cameras. They'll go for a kind of average exposure. And normally, my experience of those exposures is that they never give me quite what I want. So when I'm using my DSLR, I'm always setting the exposure against something that I know will give me a good starting point for the overall exposure of the shot, and I might then correct that in something like Photoshop, but in post-processing. That's something else to come back to. So you can have this problem of either part of the image is burnt out, it's too bright, or you might have shadows that are too dark and you lose what's in the shadow. So HDR is basically a software function, and what the camera does when you have HDR on is it actually stitches together two or more images. So when you point at a scene and press the shutter, it actually will take 2 or 3, possibly 4 photographs when you hit the shutter button once, and then the software will just put them all together and look for the best exposure of those light areas and those dark areas, so that the overall image has a much better exposure than you will get if you just didn't have that function, if you just took a single shot. So I hope that's made a bit of sense. But my recommendation to you, unless you're doing something particularly creative and you want to take advantage of overexposure or underexposure, is to make sure HDR is on. As I say, normally that's the default setting anyway, and use that. And you can experiment, just turn it off and take a picture, and then turn it on and take the same picture, and you'll notice. You should notice a difference, particularly if you have the sky in there. Normally, if there's some blue, if you have a sky that's got some cloud and blue sky, you should see a difference in the way that the picture's exposed. So that's one thing that I do like with smartphone cameras. Coming back to the format you're shooting in, most cameras that I'm aware of give you a JPEG image, and that's done to save space on the phone in this case. Now, certainly early on, first of all, the cameras weren't that great, so the images tended to be quite small anyway, but also they didn't have that much memory in them. As with computers, and it seems everything else, as time's gone on, the storage space available has increased. So what would have been a problem a few years ago is something you wouldn't even think about, because there's so much storage space on the phones. Nonetheless, you have to remember that JPEG is a compressed format, which means that you lose a lot of the original detail from the photograph. Now, JPEG is great if you want to use the photographs for social media, or you don't want a particularly high resolution. If you're doing, you can get away with them on photo books, but I wouldn't have the pictures too big, because it becomes noticeable that they're compressed rather than from a raw image. But to be perfectly honest with you, for what most people use their photographs for, the JPEG is fine. But if you're looking to do something a little bit different, a little more creative, or you want to do some more extensive, bit more serious post-processing, then you might find that a limitation. You might have to look at ways around that. So I don't know if there are cameras that offer other standard formats on the phone. I've not researched it. I'm not an expert on smartphones, I'll be honest. So that might be something to look at, or you might want to comment on the podcast. You're welcome to do that and put me straight on that one. So HDR is good. The size is good. The access it gives you is very good. Another thing that I found, now is probably less true today than it was a few years ago, but I remember going down to watch Vivid, which is happens in May usually in Sydney, and it's where they project these light displays onto the Opera House, and it's kind of grown, so it's also in different areas of Sydney these days. But I remember going down on the ferry to Circular Quay to get photographs of these light displays on the Opera House, and what I found was that my digital camera was really pushed with the amount of light available, whereas the smartphone was able to handle the low light situation much better. Now, as I say, that's probably, in fact, I know it has changed with most cameras, but that might be an area where your smartphone is a little bit better. And the reason is that the smartphone camera technology is based on movie camera technology rather than still camera technology. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because I don't want to get too technical, and it's not something I know that much about. I'm more into what I do when I'm using the camera, but not the details of the technologies. But that is an area, the low light performance might be better on your smartphone than you find on your DSLR, for example. Okay, so I'm going to talk about lenses, because this podcast is predominantly about wildlife photography, although I have kind of broadened what I've been speaking about in that. So it's got some more general photography in there. What happens if you want to use the smartphone for things like wildlife photography? Now, obviously it's not ideal, and certainly anything that's happening fast, you're going to be really pushed. You can shoot video, and I'll talk about the video side in a moment. And also I'll come back to post-processing. But if you're shooting an animal that's just sitting, so I'm thinking of a lion. I was actually in South Africa, and one of the rangers was doing this. If you have binoculars handy, what you can do is put the camera, the lens part of the camera, against the binoculars, where it obviously would look through, and then you can look at the screen on the smartphone and see what you're seeing. So you've basically stuck a telephoto lens onto the smartphone. Now, it's not elegant. You can't do it when you're moving about. It's kind of tricky to do, but it is one way around it if you happen to be in that situation and it's not something you do regularly. However, there is another option, and that is that you can buy external clip-on lenses, which will work with, as far as I'm aware, most phones. And they then give you a much more elegant solution, and it's also because they're physically clipped onto the phone and properly fitted onto the camera lens on the smartphone. You've got a much better setup, so it's much easier to use, and that can give you wide angle. It can give you telephoto, so it's worth having a look. You might have to Google that. I don't have the links immediately to hand, but if you want to ask me for more information on that, just drop me an email, graham@ge.photography, and I will help you out as I can. But that's something to just investigate, see what's available for your own smartphone. And there may well be external lenses that you can clip on. Now, again, working with Colin, he usually has sets of lenses. He'll go and investigate what's available for the smartphones he uses, and he uses a few. And his camera kit will normally fit in a bum bag, whereas mine has to go in a backpack. So you can get things, not just lenses, but things like small tripods, obviously, those sort of things, and they can all be very useful if you're trying to do more interesting photography, let's say, with your smartphone. Now, I'm going to mention post-processing because I did allude to it before, and I want to just follow up on that. So you can obviously use the images you've taken on things like Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever it is you're using. And also, a lot of cameras these days have software which allow you to edit the image on the phone. So you can crop it, you can change the color, you can go black and white, all of those kind of things. I generally recommend that when you've done your editing, you save it as a copy. And as with any digital photo, I always download them onto a hard drive somewhere, or you put them on the cloud or wherever you want to store your photographs. But I prefer to keep the original because in the moment that you've taken it, or if you're doing the post-processing immediately after taking it, you might have an idea in mind, and that might be great. But if you go back to them a bit later, you might get a different idea. And this is something I do feel quite strongly about because I think it's very true. And I know photographers who will take their photographs and then won't look at them for 3 months. And the reason is simply that when you look at a photograph immediately after you've taken it, you are looking at it through the lens of what you had in mind when you took the shot. You may have got it, you may not have done, and that often determines with most photographers whether or not they keep it. If they haven't got exactly the shot they had in mind when they press the shutter, they might just delete it straight away. Whereas if you go back a few months later, and I've certainly experienced this a lot of times, you're then looking at the image for what it is, with no preconceptions, no expectations, none of that stuff. And with that lens, or perhaps lack of lenses, you're looking at the image and you can see what's there, and you might get a different idea. You might just suddenly have a moment of inspiration, or you just had seen something the week before and you realize you can do that with that photograph. So I'm a big believer in not deleting things, certainly not straight away. I mean, maybe what you want to review your photographs a few months later, and then maybe it's sort of valid to delete a few of them, or you might have a set that are very similar and you might want to only keep one of them. But if you're not sure, I would keep them. I mean, generally storage these days is very easy to get, so we're not generally limited by where we store our photographs. And here I'm talking hard drives or the cloud or wherever. But I certainly believe it's worth hanging on to them. So that's the word on post-processing. So again, you can look at the phone, what's on there. There are apps for all sorts of things these days. I'm not even across now what's available, but you can get additional post-processing on the phone. For things like Photoshop and Lightroom, if you've got a subscription through something like Adobe's Creative Cloud, they do apps that sit on the phone. And so you have a version of Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever you're using on the phone, so you can use those packages without having to go to a PC. So there are some options there. Okay, the final thing I wanted to talk about are the other modes that you get. So on the still side, where I tend to use my phone when I'm doing wildlife is often just to get a panorama. So I like the panorama modes on. I'm more used to using iPhones. As I say, I've now got the Samsung. I bought that about a year ago, and the panorama on that is good as well. So I love doing panoramic shots. So again, I recommend practicing with it just to make sure you know how the camera works. And this is true of any camera before you go away, if you're going away somewhere. But do play with the panorama function, and you might find you get some interesting results there. Certainly, if you do it when you've got moving vehicles and things like that going through, you'll definitely get some odd results. But that is something I do use. And obviously, you've got video capability on the phone. Now, a lot of digital cameras have video capability as well. Again, because you've got the phone, most people carry a phone most of the time. In fact, it's difficult to find people sometimes without a phone on them. So it means you've got that video capability just with you. Now, you'll probably find there are settings on the phone that allow you to store or record video in different ways. I'm not going to go into that because I don't know what phone you're using, and I'm only going to talk generally in this podcast. But the kind of thing that you can do are things like slow-mo. So that was one thing I would do if I was somewhere and we were camping overnight, and with no electricity, no Wi-Fi. You can talk to each other and have a beer, and we would do that if we were camping. Say in Namibia or Zimbabwe or somewhere like that. But a fun thing to do is just take slow-mo of the campfire and with the phone. Obviously not getting too close because you don't want to melt it and damage it. But that was kind of a fun thing to do. So slow-mo can be a fun one to play with, and it might suit a style of photography that you have or that you just want to play around with. The other one is time-lapse. Now, again, the phone itself may well have a time-lapse ability. If not, there are apps you can get I'm pausing because I'm just trying to remember what I've used before, but it's not coming to me. So again, you can Google what's available, or you can always contact me and I'll let you know what I've used in the past. But time-lapse is great fun. You can, whether it's landscapes, street photography, roads, cars, anything. It's just a very interesting perspective, and it might be something you want to play with, and it might expand the range of your photography, which after all is what we ideally want to be doing with all these different options we have with the technologies available today. And I'm not just talking about smartphones, but with any digital camera. So that does pretty much cover what I've got written down anyway. You might have some questions. And again, with all of these podcasts, you're very welcome to just contact me with questions. I'll put in the description what I think of at the time. But I always miss things. That's just the nature of it. So there you go. So going back to the original question, can you take great photographs with your smartphone? Well, I would say yes. Certain caveats on that, and it also depends what you mean by great photographs. But basically, the smartphone, the cameras on smartphones are definitely serious cameras. The compact camera market has pretty much gone now. I think there might still be one or two about, but they're more the sort of throwaway type cameras. But the serious compact camera market has been replaced by smartphones because most of us have one, and why would you buy something else that does what you've already got? Because the cameras these days on phones are very good. I certainly would say they're very good cameras, and in some situations, and I've mentioned street photography, they're perhaps superior in most respects to what you would get with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, or at least they're an equivalent, unless you're doing some very niche stuff and you need the ability to capture raw images and do post-processing, and or the formats that the smartphone camera saves do limit what you can do, or they might not allow you to do what you want to do. So that is it. I hope you found that interesting, and I'm going to stop talking. So I'll speak to you on the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.